Hello everybody and welcome back to another entry of iKenSleep. I hope you all are doing well and taking good care of yourselves as we are now starting volume 2 of Heaven Official's Blessing. If you have not already, please go listen to Heaven Official's Blessing volume 1 first and then come back here for volume 2. As per usual, as a reminder, if you guys are enjoying these readings and would like for me to continue doing these readings, you guys can leave me some likes, leave me some comments, share my stuff, and follow me on my platforms like iKenSleep on Spotify, iKenWin on YouTube, iKenWin on TikTok, and officially.iKenWin on Instagram. Let's ascend into the realm of Volume 2 of Heaven Official's Blessing. Chapter 12. In the Palace of Divine Might, Crown Prince meets Crown Prince. Part 1. Xilian knew this ring must have been left behind by Huachang. He held it in his hand and wondered for a moment. What could this be? When Xilian was still an esteemed crown prince, he grew up in the palace of Shenle. The kingdom of Shenle had always reveled in beautiful, precious objects. Collectors who held aesthetics above all else were abundant, and the palace itself was of course glorious and dazzling. Golden columns, jaded steps, innumerable treasures, and precious jewels. The noble children even played with colored gems as if they were toys. Xilian was thus familiar with the sight of riches, and from the look of this ring, it appeared to be made of diamond, but its shape was exquisite. Even the most skilled jeweler likely couldn't craft an equal to the ethereal, natural beauty it emanated. Moreover, of all the diamonds he had ever seen, this stone was extraordinarily clear, shimmering like crystal, fascinating and sublime. That scintillating luster made it difficult for him to determine exactly what kind of stone it could be. Still, even if he couldn't tell what the ring was made of, it was certainly an item of extreme significance. If it was found around his neck, then it had clearly not been accidentally dropped. It was most likely a gift from Huachang, a keepsake. Xilian was a little surprised to receive a memento like this, and he smiled softly. He resolved to take good care of it, and to ask the youth what the gift meant the next time they met. All he owned was this broken down shrine, and in it, there was nowhere appropriate for him to hide treasure. After giving it some thought, he decided the best place to keep it was on his person after all. And thus, Xilian fastened the silver chain around his neck once more. After running around Mount Yujun and Banyue Pass back to back, Xilian lay paralyzed in Puchi Shrine for a few days. If it wasn't for the kindness of some overly passionate villagers who came with offerings of buns and kanji, he would have probably stayed incapacitated for many days more. He spent his time thus, until one day, a sudden message arrived from Ling Wen. Return to the heavens at once. Judging by her tone, something bad was about to happen. Xilian could guess more or less what it was, and was already mentally prepared. Is this about Banyue Pass? That's right, Ling Wen replied. When you've returned to the heavens, come directly to the Palace of Divine Might. Upon hearing Palace of Divine Might, Xilian froze. Junwu was back. Since his third ascension, he hadn't yet seen Junwu. As the #1 martial god, Junwu spent his days deep in secluded cultivation or out patrolling the realms and keeping the world at peace. With his return, it looked as though Xilian wouldn't be able to get out of making this trip. And so, after only a few days of rest, he hiked up to the heavenly capital once more. The divine palaces of all manner of gods and immortals had been built in the heavenly capital, each with their own history and style. Together, they formed the great city. There were sculpted pillars and muraled buildings here, little bridges and streams there. There was a transcendent ambience in the air, and clouds diffused beneath one's feet. The heavenly court had a single main road. the Grand Avenue of Divine Might. Although there were many such roads built in honor of Junwu in the mortal realm, such mortal monuments were but a hollow mimicry of their true form in the heavens. Only this road in the heavenly court was the true Grand Avenue of Divine Might. Xilian walked down the expansive road and headed toward the Palace of Divine Might. En route, there were many heavenly officials hurrying along, but not a single one dared acknowledge him. Truthfully, there were not many to begin with who would acknowledge him when he visited the heavenly court. However, not acknowledge meant no fellow officials would approach and walk with him or initiate any conversation. But they would still nod in greeting and give him basic due courtesy. But now, they were pretending he wasn't there at all, as if a single glance at him would get them in trouble. If they were in front of him, they would hurry away. If they were behind him, they would slow their pace, leaving him a wide berth, desperately hoping his feet would carry him meters away from them. Xilian had gotten used to this sort of treatment long ago, so he didn't think anything of it. After all, he did just drag down the mighty, newly ascended General Pei Jr. It would be stranger if no one stayed away. Yet, unexpectedly, as he walked, a voice suddenly called out from behind him. "Your Highness!" Xilian was amazed at the call and thought whoever had dared address him truly had commendable courage. But when he turned his head to look, the junior official that called for that highness rushed past him and ran towards someone farther ahead. He called as he ran, "Honestly, Your Highness, how could you forget your identity medallion when heading to the Palace of Divine Might? How would you even get in?" Only then did it dawn on Xilian. Of course the address, Your Highness, wasn't directed at him. There were quite a few crown princes in the heavens, so some confusion on this matter wasn't anything unusual. Yet when he glanced over and his eyes landed on the other crown prince, he paused. That young man had strong brows, bright eyes, and a wide smile. This smile was vastly different from those of many other heavenly officials. It was pure and sincere, and added an air of childlike innocence to his handsome face. Although if a less charitable official like Mu Qing provided comment, they would probably call it an air of foolishness. The young man was dressed in armor and looked exceptionally heroic. However, it didn't give him the air of a warrior, of blood and battle. Rather, it gave him an air of royal nobility, candid and radiant. Xilian froze mid-step and stared at the young man. The two in front sensed this gaze and turned back to face him. When the junior official saw who it was, his face dropped immediately. Xilian lightly inclined his head and smiled at him. "Greetings, Your Highness." The other crown prince was obviously the type who didn't mind the everyday details and didn't recognize his face. So when he saw someone greeting him, he immediately returned the sentiment with a brilliant smile. He shouted back, "Greetings." The junior official beside him gave him a subtle push. "Come on, Your Highness, let's go. We still need to get to the Palace of Divine Might." The young man, completely oblivious, could not understand why his subordinate would shove him so suddenly. He wondered aloud, "Why are you pushing me?" Xilian puffed out a laugh, and that junior official pushed even harder, urging, "The Emperor is probably already waiting for us. Please, let's go, Your Highness." The other crown prince could only give Xilian a confused look before turning to leave. Xilian stayed where he was as they walked away, and soon, distant whispers from lower-ranking officials floated to his ears. Well, that was awkward. The world is such a small place. They're both officials in the heavens. It was only a matter of time that they met. If you ask me, General Nanyang bumping into General Sun Jian is a more exciting affair. What's the rush? They'll all be coming face to face soon. Everyone's gathering at the Palace of Divine Might, aren't they? Suddenly, someone commented, "It's not just a small world. Take a look at those two. I don't like to make the comparison, but even though they are both crown princes, His Highness Tai Hua is truly noble. He would never do anything shameful like that, even if he fell from grace." The kingdom of Yang'an was more prosperous than the kingdom of Shenle, so of course the crown prince of Yang'an is stronger than that of Shenle. How the grass grows depends on the land it grew on. Simple logic. The martial god who watched over the north was Pei Ming of the palace of Mingwang. The martial god of the west was Quan Yishen of the palace of Qiying. The martial god of the southeast was Feng Shen of the palace of Nanyang. And the martial god of the southwest was Muqing of the palace of Xuanzhen. And the martial god watching over the east was Lang Qinqiu of the palace of Taihua. When Lang Qinqiu was still mortal, he was a crown prince like Shilian. Not just that, he was the crown prince of Yang'an. The kingdom of Yang'an was the country that overtook Shenle after its fall, and the founder of Yang'an was the rebel general who successfully overthrew the imperial capital of Shenle. While Shilian drifted in the mortal realm, he had also visited the east, so naturally he knew that the crown prince of Yang'an had ascended. As heavenly officials, it was inevitable that they would run into each other, so he didn't think much of it. Those gossiping junior officials, while they were supposedly whispering, weren't particularly quiet. If their prattling had been about anyone else, they might have been more wary of being overheard. But since this was Shilian, they spoke without fear of him hearing. Perhaps they even found the prospect exciting. So Shilian pretended to have heard nothing and casually walked away. Just then, another voice came from behind and called out, "Your Highness." Not again, Shilian thought. Ling Wen, with dark circled eyes and arms full of scrolls, approached him. "Everyone has gone to the Palace of Divine Might for the meeting. Be mindful once you reach the hall." Of course Shilian was aware of the situation. "What do you think General Pei Jr.'s sentence will be?" "Exile, probably," Ling Wen replied. "That's actually not too bad. Not too severe," Shilian thought. Exile was considered a temporary banishment for officials who had committed crimes, meaning the length of punishment was negotiable, and there might still be the opportunity to resume their duty. If they were found to be on their best behavior, they might one day get fished back up, maybe in 30 to 50 years, maybe in 100 or 200 years. But to Shilian, this, not too bad, was of course based on his own standards. To General Pei, it would be a completely different story. Shilian remembered another thing. "Oh yeah, Ling Wen, how goes the search for the boy with the human face disease from Mount Yujun? The one I told you about last time? Do you have any news?" "I'm very sorry, Your Highness. I don't have anything at the moment. We'll work harder on it," Ling Wen replied. Even for a heavenly official, finding a single person in such a vast world was not an easy task. Although the heavens might make faster work of it than mortals, it was still more like 10 years for the mortal realm versus 1 year for the heavens. Shilian thus said, "Thank you for your hard work." By this point, they reached the end of the avenue, and a majestic palace came into view before them. The palace had stood through the ages, yet it showed only enduring excellence and none of its antiquity. Interwoven glazed tiles adorned the golden roof, layer upon layer, blinding in their scintillation. Shilian looked up and glanced at where the Palace of Divine Might was written beneath the golden roof. The characters, written with power and with vigor, were exactly the same as they were centuries ago, unchanged. He lowered his head and stepped into the hall. Within, numerous heavenly officials were already gathered, either in groups of 2 or 3, or by their lonesome, standing in silence. The only ones permitted to enter this hall were heavenly officials who had officially ascended. All imperial sons of heavens or indomitable overlords, each bursting with spiritual might. They eyed each other in silent pride and judgment, their splendor overwhelming. Gathered here, at this time and place, everyone held their breaths and did not dare utter a sound. Upon the throne at the very end of the hall, there sat a martial god clad in white armor. This martial god had a handsome face, and with his eyes closed and his lips unspeaking, he appeared extremely poised and solemn. Behind him stood the expanse of the magnificent palace of divine might, and beneath his feet there were pure white snowy peaks. As if sensing that Xilian had entered the hall, he opened his eyes. Those eyes were obsidian black, but bright and clear, as if formed by the melted snow of a lake that had been frozen for millions of years. As he blinked them open, the martial god smiled softly. "Xinle, you have come." Xilian inclined his head in a respectful bow and said nothing. When Junwu spoke, he was not loud, but his deep voice echoed through the entire palace of divine might. All the eyes of the gathered officials focused on Xilian, and he understood immediately. It appeared that this meeting wasn't for discussing General Pei Jr. and the Banyue Pass scandal. The spotlight, it seemed, was on him. Ling Wen approached the throne, dressed all in black and not sparing a word or smile. He drew a line through an item in the book she was holding. "My lord, there are a few heavenly officials still on patrol in the mortal realm, unable to return." Junwu nodded. "They have been given their notice ahead of time." Ling Wen acknowledged the response, and Junwu turned to Xilian once more. "Xinle, I am sure you are aware as to why you have been summoned here today." Xilian still had his head bowed. "I can guess. However, I had actually assumed that a decision had been made on the matter with General Pei Jr." Just then, a lyrical male voice called out from behind. "How that matter will be decided is still hard to say." When Xilian turned his head to look, a martial god stepped into the great hall. His hand resting on the hilt of his sword, he walked toward the front. When he passed by Xilian, he stopped in his step, and the corners of his lips lifted. "Your Highness, I've heard so much about you." This martial god looked to be about 26 or 27 years old. Graceful in his demeanor, but resolute in his actions. Looking at his face, Xilian thought he was even more attractive than that statue he'd seen at Mount Yujun. It was the kind of handsomeness that could steal hearts, very much the charming type. Xilian didn't respond. He continued, "Our little Pei has certainly been in your care." "I've definitely offended him," Xilian thought. He returned the greeting. "You flatter me. I've heard more about you, General Pei." The words, "I've heard more about you," was certainly not a lie. In the past few days, Xilian had skimmed through his scroll and briefly read the legends of some of the more famous heavenly officials. Among them was General Ming Wang, Pei Ming. This martial god of the north was skilled in battle, but the subject the mortals talked of with the most relish was his many amorous intrigues, the beautiful and the ugly, the stories left behind in wanton alleys. Beautiful stories had Pei Ming spend extravagant amounts of gold to save a famed yet pitiful escort from the brothels, prompting her to fall in love with him and henceforth remain pure and true to await his return. Ugly stories had Pei Ming travel 1,000 miles for a one-night stand with a married woman, etc., etc., and so on. On some level, Pei Ming was an awe-inspiring man. After reading through his stories, Xilian thought it was quite unbelievable that after so many years, Only one Xuanji had been created from this way of life. Because Pei Ming was accomplished in both battle and in love, his rivals and peers alike took great pleasure in cursing him to die, even better if he'd die from syphilis. But his fate was tough and relentless, and he never caught anything from the many flowers he'd plucked. He wouldn't die, and he'd even live longer than most of his peers, until finally, one day, he lost a battle. Everyone laughed, thinking, "At last, he's met his end." But then lightning crashed and thunder roared, and in that moment of imminent peril, he ascended to the heavens. Those who hadn't already died by his hand probably all died of outrage. After ascension, Pei Ming didn't change his way of life, and the scale of his tales of promiscuity only grew, from fairies and lady heavenly officials to female ghosts and demons. As long as they were beautiful, he would not hold back. Nonetheless, the charming ladies of the mortal realm still remain his favorite type. Many indecent love stories had him starring as the main male lead, and if it wasn't for Shilian's method of cultivation that demanded purity of body and of mind, he probably would have read a few of those books just out of curiosity. Thus, in addition to his role as the martial god that ruled the north, the mortal realm also worshipped him as the god of love. Even a number of heavenly officials would turn around and secretly pray to him should they bump into him in the heavens, hoping for some fortune in love. It had to be said that, although similar in sentiment, such a title was definitely more fortunate than Feng Xin's unwarranted title of tremendous masculinity. All the heavenly officials present in the hall were well aware of what both of these "I've heard so much about you" comments meant, and many roared with laughter in their heads. After such pleasantries, Shilian said, "What does General Pei mean by hard to say?" Pei Ming snapped his fingers, and a corpse suddenly appeared in the middle of the great hall, floating in midair. Strictly speaking, this floating body was just a shell. It had no primordial spirit, completely empty on the inside. But it was covered in blood from head to toe, so by any practical measure, it was no different from a corpse. It had a handsome face, but its eyes were firmly shut. It was indeed a Zhao, or rather, General Pei Jr.'s clone. To have such a thing appear so suddenly before an elegant crowd of heavenly officials inside the Palace of Divine Might was startling. A moment later, Pei Shu was also brought in, but he still looked indifferent and apathetic even with shackles binding him. His head was bowed low, and he was silent. "General Pei, what's the meaning of this?" Shilian asked. Pei Shu knelt down within the Palace of Divine Might, and Pei Ming replied, "During Little Pei's investigation, he mentioned something I found quite curious." Pei Ming paced halfway around Shilian and smiled. "I'm quite familiar with Little Pei's ability. Even if his clone's powers are reduced and nowhere near the level of his true self, it's still quite competent and capable of fighting evenly with a wrath ghost. However, he told me that he was surprised to meet a mortal who was so strong that Little Pei was unable to even withstand his attacks. Now, isn't that curious?" Pei Ming continued, "And so I pressed for answers. It turns out, at the time, there was a red-clothed young man beside your highness while you were at Banyue Pass." Hearing the words red cloth made all the officials present shift expressions, and they all appeared uncomfortable. But Pei Ming's next statement made them completely agitated. And this young man, in the dark, was able to eradicate every Banyue soldier turned wrath in a flash. Now, your highness, might you enlighten us as to who this red-clothed young man might be? If it wasn't a wrath, Then it must be a supreme. A supreme that could kill hundreds of wraths in a flash. A supreme dressed all in red. Anyone could guess who that young man probably was. Yet no one wanted to be the first to say the name. Xilian cast a glance at the silent Pei Xiu and replied a little unnaturally. Really? I don't remember it very well. There was a caravan trapped in Banyue Pass at the time, and we spent a few days together. Maybe it was someone from the caravan. Well, that can't be right, Your Highness, Pei Ming said. According to Little Pei, you and that young man were unusually close. Not like someone you'd only just met or had only known for a few days. How can you not recall such a thing? No, you're wrong. That was the truth. It really was only a few days, Xilian thought. Nevertheless, his face gave nothing away. Just then, from the sidelines, a white-clad cultivator casually waved his whisk and spoke up. General Pei, you've only heard Little Pei's side of the story. Little Pei has committed a crime, and he's currently in detention, soon to be exiled. Whether his words are believable is still hard to tell, no? Then we shall see if General Nanyang and General Sun Jian can assist us, Pei Ming replied. Following his line of sight, Xilian found Feng Xin and Mu Qing standing separately in the southwest and southeast corners of the hall. Feng Xin still looked the same as in his memories, tall as always, standing extremely straight, his eyes determined, and his brows forever slightly furrowed. It made it seem that there was always something irritating him, but really he wasn't irritated at all. Mu Qing, on the other hand, was somewhat different from what he remembered. His face was still pale without much redness, and his lips still thin and pursed. His eyes half-lidded. However, there was an aloof air surrounding him, one that clearly indicated he was interested in neither conversation nor the dispensing of compliments. He stood with his arms crossed, a finger on his right hand, tapping his left elbow softly. It was hard to tell if he was at ease or if he was scheming something. While the two were considered good-looking men, each had their own flaws. Hearing Pei Ming call them out, they both looked toward Junwu at the same time. It was only when Junwu gave a slight nod that they reluctantly stepped forward. This was the first time since Xilian's third ascension that he'd come face to face with the two of them. He could sense all the eyes upon them going wild with excitement. Wild was inevitable. It was known that the Palace of Divine Might was the #1 martial palace of heaven, and those without the title of heavenly official had no right to enter or attend court. The first time the Crown Prince of Shinla ascended, Feng Xin and Mu Qing were his deputy generals. At the time, they were only low-ranking officials from the middle court without even the right to scrub the floors of the Palace of Divine Might. And now, not only could these former junior officials stand openly in the palace's hall, but their ranks were even higher than that of their former master. What a turn of fate. How times had changed. The three of them looked at each other, eyes flitting all over, stealing glimpses at one another, but swiftly turning away and pretending not to care. Who knew what the other two were thinking? However, Xilian had pretty much figured out why Pei Ming had called them out to help. As suspected, Pei Ming said, General Nanyang and General Sun Jian had both fought Huachang before. I'm sure they can speak with authority regarding the weapon used by that person. So the point of bringing forth the empty shell as Zhao was for the court to inspect its wounds. Feng Xin and Mu Qing slowly approached the floating body. Xilian himself took a few steps forward to take a look, but it was splotched with so much dark blood that it was hard to discern anything. The other two, faces austere, took their time in their inspection. Finally, they raised their heads and swept a look at each other, seeming like neither of them wanted to speak first. Ling Wen prompted from next to the throne. Generals, your conclusion? It was Feng Xin who spoke first, his voice dark.
It's him.
The scimitar, Ming, Mu Qing added. Xilian was probably the only one among the heavenly officials present at the Palace of Divine Might who didn't know the significance of those words. The scimitar Ming was the very same freakish weapon Huachang had used when he challenged those 33 officials and single-handedly beat them to a pulp, annihilating their souls and dignity both. Inside the Palace of Divine Might, the heavenly officials started whispering to each other, unreadable eyes watching Xilian. Many thanks to the two generals for confirming this fact, which verified my conjecture, Pei Ming said. If the red-cloth young man who traveled next to your highness really was that person, then this matter is considerably more complicated. The white-clad cultivator from before spoke up again. General Pei, do you truly mean to imply that His Highness colluded with the Supreme Ghost King to frame General Pei Jr.? Both times that cultivator spoke, he was on Xilian's side, so Xilian had to see who exactly this curious fellow cultivator was. What he saw was a person with clear, bright eyes. He wore a white jaded belt, held a whisk in his arms, and had a long sword carried on his back, with a folding fan tucked at his waist. His form was graceful and elegant, his expression spirited. And while he did look familiar, Xilian couldn't recall when he had met a friend such as this. Pei Ming also gave the man a look, appearing like an annoyed elder who didn't want to deal with children. He shook his head and waved dismissively, dispersing the floating empty shell that was a Zhao, then turned around and continued his arguments. It may not be collusion. That person is powerful and wicked. Who knows what deceptive tricks he might have used to blind His Highness? Pei Ming intended to pin all the chaos at Banyue Pass on Huachang. Xilian rebuked him. General Pei, even if you won't believe me, you should still believe in Lord Windmaster. General Pei Jr. admitted to the crime of luring passerby to Banyue Pass with his clone, and Lord Windmaster heard everything. Pei Ming glanced at the white-clad cultivator again. Xilian continued. Besides, since we're both here at the Palace of Divine Might, you can simply ask the Emperor whether there are traces of any spells of deception cast on me. Jun Wu, who sat high above, remained calm and unchanging. That meant Xilian was absolved. Xilian then continued. General Pei, let's keep things clear and separate. Let's not talk about whether the young man I traveled with was Huachang or not. At the very least, even if he was indeed Huachang, that has nothing to do with what General Pei Jr. has done. A Supreme Ghost King might have the worst possible name on people's tongues, but not everything can be blamed on him. Xilian's own expression was composed and neutral when he uttered that name, but many in the hall felt cold shivers run down their backs. Pei Ming replied, Regardless, I believe this case needs to be re-examined. It would be best if the State Preceptor of Banyue that your highness has taken could be brought in for interrogation too. To interrogate her for what? Torture her to confess a lie? Xilian hadn't yet responded when someone else spoke up. Pei Shu looked as if he didn't want to remain in the Palace of Divine Might a moment longer. He said in a low voice, General, let it go. What? Pei Ming was irritated. There wasn't any spell of deception. This was all my doing. I've disappointed you, sir, Pei Shu confessed. Pei Ming was right in the middle of clearing his name when Pei Shu said this. Pei Ming turned cold, and he said darkly, What bewitching concoction did that State Preceptor of Banyue feed you? Shut your mouth! However, Pei Shu raised his head. Let it go, General! Little Pei isn't afraid to admit to things he's done. Since I've been caught red-handed, I'm prepared to receive any punishment that is handed down. Pei Ming's face was written with shock, and it clearly read as, You've always been so sensible,
So why did you suddenly go nuts today?
He was just about to kick some sense back into Pei Xiu when Junwu spoke.
Enough.
The moment that word was said, Pei Ming withdrew his leg and bowed. Thus spoke Junwu.
The case of the Banyue Pass is settled. Take little Pei away. He is to be exiled in a few days' time.
After some silence, Pei Ming acknowledged. Yes, my lord. Xilian had only just breathed in relief when Pei Ming continued. But Nanyang and Shenzhen had proven that the wounds on that empty shell were indeed inflicted by the scimitar of Ming.
I understand,
Junwu replied. That is a whole other matter. Pray my lord will look into it, Pei Ming said.
I will investigate, naturally. There is no need for concern.
After a pause, Junwu continued.
You are all dismissed for today. Shenle, you stay.
It looked like Xilian would be personally interrogated. The heavenly officials had nothing left to say, and bowed. Yes, my lord. To be continued.